have an unidentified flying object.
I'm Jack Oswald, and you're listening.
This is Nephilim, and you're listening to...
I'm Richard C. Hoagland, and you're listening to...
I'm Art Bell, and you're listening to Dr. J Radio Live.
We have an unidentified flying object.
That is right, folks. You heard it straight from a few friends that you are listening to Dr. J Radio Live. That happens to be me. I am your humble host of Dr. J Radio Live, broadcasting right from the City of Angels, where also my guests are. If you haven't had a chance to check them out through all the social media accounts, I'll give you a quick moment to do so. While I must also say that we are not just broadcasting coast to coast PM in the United States or North America, South America for that matter, we are truly an international show. Right off the bat, we do have my co-host who happens to be sitting in his studio live in London, where it is 3 a.m. Greenwich Mean Time, 10 p.m. Eastern Time, where my webmaster is, and where my two guests and myself, 7 p.m. Pacific Time. Now, today is a super special show for many reasons. First of all, these are incredible guests, always on top of their work, and they go above and beyond. And one thing I have to say before I even introduce them is the series that we're going to talk about, and this is just one piece of what we're going to talk about. I have never figured out after the sixth one, how can you make something better when you've already reached perfection? Yet these two gentlemen have seemed to have done it every single time. They outdo themselves. And I'm just scratching my head wondering, how can that be? Well, guess what? The newest one is out, 10. Now I'm going to spoil it for you. That is Watchers 10 DNA. And hands down, the best out of the other 9. Not to say that the other 9 are not 10s or 11s out of 10. This you have to see. So I strongly suggest everybody out there go and get the new set that they have, which has literally all 10 discs. And I say, start with 10, then you can go back to 1, and then work your way to 9. And then watch 10 again. Watch them all again. That's what I got to say. So, without further ado, let's bring the stars of the show. We have the person that you see and hear the most because he's on camera, author, researcher, radio host, and so much more. That happens to be the one and only L.A. Marzulli. Mr. Marzulli, welcome back, my friend.
Hey, great to be here, Dr. J.
And of course, we have your partner in crime when it comes to the Watcher series and other things, who does a fantastic job using filming, directing, editing, and everything else in between, not to mention what you guys do with regards to research off the camera. And that is Richard Shaw. Mr. Shaw, welcome back.
Hey, Dr. J, thanks for having us on. This is a blast.
It's a blast, and I hope everybody out there gets ready for what you are going to hear. And I really hope that right after this show, and yes, I want to thank, of course, Ira Robinson and Michael Varr of Late Night in the Midlands for taking our show. Same with Angel Espino in PS for PSN Radio. Not forget JCD Program Radio Network, where you'll also hear this show again and again and again. I hope everybody out there globally gets their hands on this copy of Watchers 10 and watches it, because it is that fantastic. So why don't you guys, I'm going to go ahead and start with LA, then go to Richard, and then we already got a caller, so I'll let you guys talk about Watchers 10 real quick. And before we dive into it, let's just see what this first caller is asking for. LA? Mr. LA.
I am here. You want me to talk about Watchers 10? Is that
yeah. Start it.
I was a little confused. I thought you wanted to talk about bringing the caller, but listen.
No, I was saying we'll talk about Watchers 10, then we'll bring the caller, yeah.
You know, Richard Shaw and I have done 10 of these things, and I got to tell you, when we first started, I called him up and I said, Rick, and I was incensed because I had just come out of this casting call, and I'm going, these people don't know anything about anything, and we got to make our own movie. We got to make our own series. And Richard goes, how much money do we have? We have no money. He goes, that's great. So he comes over, and that was really the nexus of the whole Watchers series. And that's like, what, 6 years ago, Rick? And it's just, we've never really looked back on a handshake. There's no contract. There's nothing. It's just like we started making these things, and they started taking off, and we realized that we were hitting on a nerve. And this is amazing, something that we both tried to do, and I have to defer to Richard on this because he's really, really careful, and he spends an enormous amount of time to make sure the film is accessible to as many people as possible. And what I mean by that, we're never preachy. We don't sit there and hit people over the head with the Bible or force our particular worldview on people. Now, you contrast that, let's say, to, with all due respect, Ancient Aliens, which tells us week after week, ancient astronaut theorists. Okay, right. That's their paradigm. They're entitled to it. We really don't really do that so much. I mean, people know who we are and what we're about, but we give people a platform to speak. And the other thing, when Richard edits, I mean, he's not like cherry picking things. He's not. Rick, you remember that? What was it? Robert Salas went with us, and the reason why he went with us is because we allowed him to view his interview. Robert Salas saw the UFO over Malmstrom Air Force Base. He'd never gone on camera because no one would allow him to work the editing process. So we said, sure, we'll show it to you. And we interviewed him, and because Rick is so fair with the editing, it was no problem. He just signed off on it. That's in Watchers 7 or 8.
He didn't ask me to do a single change.
Not a single change.
And let's also mention, when he was on the last time, he dropped a bombshell on me, because this is before he went on publicly at a Zero event, where he said that him and his wife Marilyn were taken from their homes by these extraterrestrials, extradimensionals, and that account was very chilling.
What?
Nonetheless, let's check out who's been sitting on hold. Area code 256. Welcome to the show. What's your name and city? Hello, 256. Okay, we're going back to our guests. Let's go back to 10. All right. So
I was just going to say about Captain Solace. The first time I heard that story was because our departed friend Roger Lear, who we all knew,
I was at the alien implant doctor. For those of you who have only emerged onto paying attention to this topic fairly recently, this man is legendary. For 20 plus years, that's what he was doing.
Yeah, and he was a really good friend, but he had invited me to a meeting that Stephen Bassett was putting on. Stephen Bassett is a DC lobbyist for the disclosure movement, and Stephen is a no-nonsense guy, and he's dedicated his whole life to getting disclosure, and we're beginning to think that this may happen sooner than later. But I got to hear Captain Solace's entire story at this meeting, and again at a Zero meeting with Yvonne. But what was interesting is I went up and asked him some really some questions that offered more detail into the event that happened. And his wife watched the whole thing, but was paralyzed and couldn't move.
Yeah.
And she described the same thing. And this is the only time I've ever heard of an abduction story like this, where there were two people involved in it, and both of them saw the same stuff. So to me, that was pretty compelling.
I'm glad you mentioned that, because a lot of people talk about being woken up and them having their spouses lying in bed right next to them where they can't wake up, and they're taken, returned, and boom, next day everything's hunky-dory except for that one person. But you're right, this is very unique in that case where you have two of them, and very credible, down-to-earth people. And that's what I love about Captain Solace. He never exaggerated about anything, and when it came time to speculate, he would be very careful on what he said, just to never take away from the truth.
Oh, totally. Absolutely no nonsense with him.
Now, let me, hold on a second. I see Johnny. Go ahead. I know you got a question. Go ahead, my friend.
I wanted to know if they had any understanding, because I know that when you're on camera, it's very difficult to say your inner feelings and stuff. But you went to Dr. David Jacobs' home and you spent some time with him, and he told you exactly how he feels, how he's not very optimistic about the future. That's on camera. What does he say off camera to you guys? You know, how do you feel about what he says?
L.A.?
Well, I mean, Dr. Jacobs was a contact that I, let me put it this way. I first contacted him well over a decade ago now, and he actually did a written interview with me with a book called The Alien Interviews. And then later we turned that into further evidence, and he elaborated on that. He's controversial. A lot of people, it's so funny. People look at his research and they'll poo-poo it and say it's just like he's drawing conclusions and he's doing this, but these people never really sit down and really listen to what he's done. Never saw the overwhelming amount of time, resources, and energy, and not only that, his reputation that he's put on the line with what can only be looked at as an extremely controversial subject. And I get it. If some people go, there's not any proof of hybrids. Well, wait a second. That's not true. We've had people come on the record with us, not only in Watchers, but just in PPS Report, our new TV show that Rick and I put on a weekly basis. Black-eyed kids, that's a hybrid being. What we show in Watchers 10, this winged creature, that's some sort of a hybrid, according to Jaime Maussan. Look, nobody's got all the answers. But what we found about Dr. Jacobs in our dealings with him on and off camera, very forthright, very straight ahead. This is his life's work. This is what he's done. He's very concerned about the future because he thinks it's a replacement program by one species, i.e. ET, over the people of Earth. That's what he's holding to. And, he talks about, and I've read his latest book, the hybrids being integrated. And we've gotten reports, not a lot, but that have come across my desk of people that haven't had encounters in 2015, nothing in 2016 yet, but in 2015, with people that were extremely weird and bizarre. One woman saw this other woman, female, at a gym. Her anatomy was wrong when she was in the shower. Just listen to what and I interviewed her, and this was all written down and put into a report, which we mailed to our people that sign up for our news magazine, shameless plug. But the bottom line is she stripped down, took off her sweaty gym clothes, went in the shower, and then after the shower came over, toweled off, and then put on the same dirty gym clothes. Nobody does this. Things like that. But there were other oddities with her that were brought out.
Let me say this real quick. Caller 256, can you mute out unless you have a question? Caller 256, are you hearing? Okay, I'm going to have to hang up on that caller at this point. Please continue, L.A.
Yeah, I'll just tell you one of the more chilling ones. And this story was told to me by a guy that I know really well. I've spoken at his venue before. His name is Mike. He's out on a Saturday morning walking through this park, and he's thinking about people and, basically praying for them. Just a lot of brokenness, people having problems, and he's just praying. That's what the guy does. He's a pastor, okay? Mm-hmm. So in the distance, he sees this woman coming towards him. Very athletic, tall, 6'2", 6'3", very tall, striking whitish, blondish hair pulled back in a ponytail. Very athletic. Well, female basketball player, female golfer. A skier. Who knows, right? But for some reason, he's uneasy and he's not sure why. And so as the woman approaches, they make eye contact. She has striking pale blue eyes. As she gets closer, about 8 to 10 feet away, remember, she's running, the eyes suddenly shift to black. At this point, he realizes he's not in Kansas anymore. And he begins to verbally rebuke her, because he knows what he's dealing with, because he's felt uneasy since the first contact he's had. Now it's like in his face, okay? As this woman, and he's like kind of standing back and verbally rebuking her out loud. As she goes past him, And he emailed me this. He texted me rather right after it happened. He said, "You're not going to believe this." And basically, as she ran past him, she turned her head, bared her teeth, and growled at him with the black eyes. Whoa. Now, is that a hybrid being?
Could be.
Could be.
Could be a unique extraterrestrial or extra-dimensional creature. The crazy thing about hybrids, and a lot of research that you've done, Jaime has done, is what I find bizarre, but at the same time not so bizarre, is the fact that you'll find that the maternal DNA is human, and yet these are clearly non-human beings. Now, I got two written things here for you. One is a message. This is hello to L.A. Marzulli and Richard Shaw. This is from Lisa J. Kastner. And their next one is a question. This is from @Don Danell. If E.T. had anything to do with human creation, why should we be surprised to find ourselves easily replaced? Who wants to take that on first?
Yeah, Rick.
Well, that's a deep one, because there is this theory, what some people refer to as panspermia, that we were all seeded here by other beings from other worlds, from other galaxies, and this is a result of that. Now, Ellie and I have talked about this. I don't know how many times we've discussed the possibility that some people on the planet could possibly have been seeded by somebody else, because there's unanswered questions as far as, well, where did the Aborigines come from?
Yes.
And we look way back. I mean, I don't know, their lineage goes back something like 20, 40,000 years, way far back beyond the creation scenario. And
7,000 years.
So yeah, so there's this what we hold to is that there was a creation event, that it was, what we read about in Scripture is incredibly abridged and abbreviated. It doesn't really give us many details on exactly what happened. It gives us just a few foundational things that occurred at that time. And we know that before that happened, Scriptures tell us that the earth was without form and void, that basically there had been a cataclysm on the earth. Now, we don't know if that cataclysm, what that was. We don't know if it's Tiamat, where another planet whacked into us, and you've heard of all of these different theories. No one really knows, but could some people have survived it, and we don't know about it? Possibly. I mean, that's my point of view. Is it could be. I'm just saying I don't know. But the idea that all of us are that way, I don't agree with that theory. I think there might be some. It would tend to offer some credence to, well, who were the Philistines? Why were there, almost like, when you put two kinds of fish in the aquarium and they don't get along,
Yes.
Why is that? And L.A., you take it from here.
Let me say one small thing real quick, Ellie. Panspermia, aside from what you said, people or beings placing us here, even mainstream scientists accept this concept, except they say asteroids hitting us with some sort of life forms. Also, when you talk about a planet hitting us, that reminds me, I believe, of Watchers 9, where you turned me on to a bizarre movie, Melancholia, which I thought was insane, because the empirical data with who you spoke to about Planet X, I just thought was fantastic. Anyhow, L.A., what's your take on what Richard said, as well as what the question?
As Richard said, the question is a very deep one, very complex one, and it's plagued Darwinists since Watson and Crick, the co-discoverers of DNA, were plagued when they actually, or vexed, I should say, when, especially Crick, when he looked at the complexity of the deoxyribonucleic double helix of life, he became a vexed man, because he realized that, wait a minute, this isn't random. This just didn't happen on its own. It's far, far too complex. It's a complex coding system. And when it's endangered, when it's broken down, when it's messed with, the results are not what you want. In other words, if you bombard fly DNA right? With radioactivity, you get monsters. So this coding is extremely complex. And what's amazing about it, for elephants, when they procreate, they get elephants. They don't get a half elephant and a centaur.
Correct.
You know, and it's going on forever and ever and ever and ever and ever. Now, there's small mutations. So that begs the question, where did this complex coding system come from? And I talk about this incessantly. Ben Stein sits down in his movie, award-winning movie, Expelled, No Intelligence Allowed, sits down with one of the premier evolutionists of the 20th, 21st century, Richard Dawkins, and asks, where did life come from? And Dawkins just says, well, no one knows. Where did the first self-replicating molecule come from? No one knows. And Stein throws some sort of an intellectual lifeline and said, well, how do you think it could have happened? And this is where Dawkins points basically to panspermia. Well, it could have happened this way. Millions of years ago in a galaxy far, far away, a race of extraterrestrials would have had to risen to some sort of a high level of civilization by some sort of Darwinian process. But that's circular reasoning, because where did they come into being? But the neo-Darwinists are holding tenaciously onto the idea of panspermia because that's all they got. Because they realize that, wait a minute, this DNA thing threw Darwinism, you know, under the bus, basically, because it doesn't work. It's way too complex. So now they look outside, and this is what I call, and have come to call, in many of my books, the coming great deception. Darwinism acts as a springboard to set up this coming great deception. Also, in the biblical prophetic narrative, we hear this exact thing. We hear that something is coming, which will basically, people will believe a lie. I'm paraphrasing. People will look at it and they'll believe it. There's a lie that's coming. It said so in the prophetic narrative. And I think that lie is, unfortunately, what the History Channel and they're all great guys over there, you know, but on Ancient Aliens, they're constantly telling us ancient astronaut theorists. And I'm right there with them. I mean, I've been to Puma Punku, and Rick and I have been to, you know,
Cusco, Caracas, yeah.
All those places. You know, we've been there, and we agree. There's an outside agency that's been here and that set up this stuff. There's an outside agency which is obsessed with the human genome. The question is, are they malevolent or benevolent? And if it's the former, we've got real problems. And what's interesting, and I'll end with this, what's interesting about this, certain prophetic narratives speak of this incursion by these intruders, for lack of a better word. Talks about these intruders coming in, and what they do is they create a hybrid being known as the Nephilim, and this ties us right into Watcher's Den, because we've got real DNA evidence which blows, in our opinion, at least in my opinion, it blows the Darwinian theory right out of the water.
And blew my mind watching it to say that. Let me read a couple comments first, and let me mention something from a recent interview.
And I want to say something else when you get done, John.
Yeah, so we're going to have to do another show.
Oh, you know, everybody out there, don't worry. You'll get. We're going to get through this entire topic if it takes 2, 3, 4, 5 shows. And not to mention, there's a lot more that these gentlemen have done. Like, for instance, when Richard Shaw joined us alone once, we did a show on the Torah codes. What about another whole documentary he's made, The Words Project? Nonetheless, let me just say these few things. A couple weeks ago, we had Linda Moulton Howe on, and she was talking about that World War II was a proxy war fought by extraterrestrials using humans to fight. The other thing which she said was that there are warring factions right now in the skies of who's going to take control of us. Now, let me read you just a couple comments, and then I'm going to go to Richard. One of them is actually a question. The same person who asked that question for you says, by the way, Watchers is a great series. I absolutely second that
Thank
motion.
you.
And thank you, sir, out there for saying that. I'm sure absolutely these gentlemen are appreciated.
Thank you very much.
Now, Lisa has another comment here. It says, this is in quotes, in the beginning is better translated as in a beginning, and that's end quote, given the Nephilim in Genesis 6. Then the final thing I want to read to you is, this is definitely a question. The cosmic egg is a worldwide theme. In Greece, it was the Orpheus stone, a pure white stone that has a flower of life symbology all over it. Supposedly brought life to earth from gods. Are you aware of this? And Richard, if you want to talk about what you talked about before we even tackle this, by all means.
Oh, all I wanted to say is L.A. brought up some really great points. It's what we talk about quite often together. And all I wanted to say was the idea of panspermia on possibly some people that ended up transplanted here on the earth eons ago were still created by our Creator. They didn't just form out of some kind of primordial goo on some other planet. I mean, there's too much design involved. So one thing that was really interesting, you might remember way back in Watchers 4, we introduced a guy named Howard Storm who had a near-death experience. And it was a really profound experience in which he remembered a whole lot of stuff. And at dinner one night I asked him, I said, I don't know if anyone's ever asked you this, Howard, but what about ETs and UFOs and all that? When you were in the heavenlies, did you ask any questions about that? And he said, yes, I did. And I said, what was the answer? He said, I was shown a parade of images. And he went to describing them. He said they were like humanoid at first, and then it was almost like Mr. Spock kind of pointy-eared people, and then it got clear down into where it looked like aquatic life and all sorts of stuff. And he said it just got so weird, he said, that I asked him to stop. So God is up there making all sorts of stuff that we've never seen before. Some of it we may start seeing. I think we're in a period here where we're going to see incredible things that are what people would refer to as being supernatural, because they don't know what else to call it. And people that haven't studied this at all are going to be shocked and have no idea what's happening. I really think it's going to happen.
That according to mainstream scientists, we barely scratched the surface as far as species here on Earth. They say that we've gone through approximately 10% of them. 90% have yet to be discovered. It's not like people have scoured through the Amazon forest and have logged every single living thing that's been there. And I'm talking about literally going through every acre in that forest. But nonetheless, there's so much there. Now, I want to bring attention, unless you guys want to tackle this question of what came from Don Danell, but I was going to bring, it took us about a quarter of the show to get into it, Afghanistan, 2005. Do you want to ask the question first, or do you want to handle that question, or do you want to go to that story?
Well, can I start out just because it's really, you're kind of a part of this in a very weird way, Dr. J.
Yeah, by all means.
And then LA can fill in here. But basically, I was on your show, and I think we were talking about the Torah Code.
Yes.
This was about a year or so ago. And I was describing what it was really like to stand on the border with Gaza and Hamas and all of that, and really what's going on over there, which the news media will not print.
And especially the saddest, I remember you showed this in Watchers 9, where Hamas came and literally assassinated an entire wedding party because they were Christians singing.
So they were singing.
Song.
Yeah, they were singing, so they were all murdered. Yeah, it's just it's unbelievable.
Saddening to see.
That will never get on mainstream media, ever.
No. But you did. You brought it. So that's why I think it's important.
So I'm describing what's really going on over there, and I've eaten at people's houses that were basically living on the border in a kibbutz right across the street from where Hamas was shooting rockets at them in the summer of 2014. And, there were Israeli tanks just, cruising by, and soldiers from the IDF. And so she was, Sarah is her name, she was feeding the soldiers, and they were sleeping in her front yard, and she was taking care of them, and a couple missiles went off nearby, and they were allowed to keep them. And last time I was in Israel, we had dinner at their house, and our son goes and grabs the nose cone of an Iron Dome missile and puts it on a dinner table. So it's kind of like a decoration as we're eating. I mean, that's really life in Israel. That's the way it actually is. But when you started bringing callers on, this guy called in and said, I just want to say that what Richard's saying is true, and I've been to Afghanistan and all this. And this guy was like, I realized really, really quickly that this guy knew what he was talking about and wasn't kidding around. And so I said, look, I'd like to talk to you some more after the show. And it was his story that ended up in Watchers 10. And if it hadn't been for that show that I was on, I would have never met him.
For you coming on and talk about the Torah codes, and that's why it was so cool when you had the screening. I'm going to spoil this for everybody. This is a little private side. We had a little screening at Richard's house the other night with L.A. and several other people. And I was blown away 15, 20 minutes into the film. I see the Dr. J logo, and then, of course, Richard explaining this. And I'm trying to think back, was it a regular caller? And clearly it wasn't, because, you know, we know those that are calling regulars, and then we have those that call every 3-6 months, and then we have those that call specifically to a guest or just happen to be catching on. So this was definitely a unique one, and the road that it set you guys onto was unbelievable. LA, take it from there.
Well, what was interesting is you know, Richard said you gotta talk to my partner. He's totally into this stuff, and I called this guy, and we'll just call him, you know, Don for tonight or whatever. But I called Don on not his real name, and I interviewed him over the phone.
We call him Mr. K in the film. Yeah,
and it's just, I mean, it's a very bizarre story, and people can say anything. And at one point I asked him point blank, I said, well, do you know who Steve Quayle is? And he said, no, I don't know who Steve Quayle is. And so well, you've never heard anything about this, about what Steve Quayle discovered. And I mailed him an audio tape of Steve Quayle on Coast to Coast talking about this giant that they had discovered, that was shipped out, and Quayle's contact was the pilot who came on the record with Quayle and talked about that he flew this thing out of Afghanistan. That's what he talks about, all right?
And that was back in 2008, 8 years ago.
So this was different. He was telling me 2002. And this man lives in an area where we had an ongoing archaeological dig, and I won't tell you the state. And so, by coincidence, he was about an hour's drive from the dig site. And so I said, well, why don't you meet me at the dig site and we'll talk? Because, you know, one thing over the phone, it's another thing face-to-face. I met this guy. He was a little nervous, but he told the same story. And every time on the phone, and I talked to him on the phone, you know, several times before we, you know, before we met face-to-face. Every time when he got to this one point in the story, and it's on camera the same way, there was, and I'm kind of getting ahead of myself, but the story is simply this, that, and let me back up a little bit. There's a platoon that goes missing, a patrol that goes missing. They're out looking for high-value targets in the mountains of Afghanistan, 2002. They go missing. They don't report back in. So after like 12 hours, another platoon, another group of soldiers are helicoptered into the same area, same landing part, to find what happened to the first guys. They're walking in very rugged terrain, very mountainous. They come down this like goat trail, which turns to the left, and they see that there's a mouth of a cave. And as they're doing that, the ground is littered with what our friend Dan thinks is bones, and he sees a piece of communications. And at this point, he's thinking like, you know, wild animal, what's going on? What comes out of the cave is a 12 to 15 foot giant with red hair, and he's got this lance, a pike, with him, and everybody's just stunned. Who wouldn't be? The training, you know, doesn't.
You're trained. You're told monsters don't exist, and then all of a sudden, it's right there.
And
yeah, and this dude is really huge, like 2 or 3 times the size of a normal person.
And when you got to understand something, when you go up a foot, I got a picture of myself standing next to a 7-footer. I'm a quarter inch under 6 feet, and next to me is a 7-foot former basketball player. I look like a midget next to this guy, and I'm not exaggerating. I show it at conferences because people have no idea. You double that? Let's be conservative.
I know. And not just double that. What about the weight? Because if you double 200 pounds, you're 400 pounds. But this beast was what, 1,200 pounds?
1,100 pounds, we think.
That is insane. That's half a ton.
That's according to the pilot that flew him out, because they knew they had probably about 400 pounds worth of hardware to tie this creature down, cargo netting and a pallet to put him on and all that. So all of that weighed 1,500 pounds with the giant on top of it.
Now, think about how much muscle mass could be in this creature. I mean, to have the ability to rip a human body in shreds, I mean, it just boggles my mind. So when people think, giant, we're not just talking about, the height. Think about body mass index and the strength, as we mentioned. I mean, and what was this about soldiers being told, instead of doing your traditional double tap of one to the chest, one to the head, where they were told to shoot above the head?
Bingo. And that was from our second witness, but we're getting way ahead of the story. The bottom line is, as the men in the patrol are stunned by this giant coming out of the cave, Captain Dan or Lieutenant Dan, whatever this guy was, which was one, apparently this guy was the first guy to break out of the trance. He starts firing. The giant moves with such speed and agility that it stuns everybody. And before anybody can do anything, the giant with this lance, which was 10 to 12 feet tall, has skewered Dan and is holding him up with one hand. Now, what's interesting is every single time in the pre-interviews that we got to this point, our witness would choke. He would lose it on the phone. Every single time he got to that part of the story. One time he just hung up on me, and then he called me back 5 minutes later. So here I am face-to-face with him now, and he's telling me the story, and sure enough, he gets to the part. And I watch people. I look for body language. I look at the eyes. I watch the hands. I look at the shoulders. Everything. He's just all part of being, an interviewer.
Yes.
To see is this guy... And he was obviously shook up. Every time that we got to that part in the pre-interviews, he would lose it. And then on camera, the same thing. He loses it on camera. He gets choked up. .308s, 47s, the whole deal, a 50 cal. I mean, they're just opening fire on this thing, and they kill it. And later on, as they're waiting to get medevac out of there, which turns into a non-medevac because Dan passed away, he died, they come to their senses. He describes the stench as being as powerful as a skunk, but not a skunk, something totally different. And what was interesting is I was at a conference, and this is where our second witness comes in, who was also ex-military, who also served in Afghanistan 3 years later. In the Kandahar province is where this giant came from. And I said, did you ever hear any rumors about a giant in Kandahar? And he just looked at me and he said, is this on the record or off the record? I said, well, will you come on the record? And he said, I will, but anonymously. I said, okay, what do you got? And he said, everyone knew about the giant at Kandahar. Everyone talked about it, but you weren't supposed to talk about it. That some giant had been killed in a cave a couple of years earlier. I mean, people knew about it. So now we got two witnesses, which is basically vetting Steve Quayle's story.
You called me from a conference telling me you had met this guy randomly that had this experience, and I said, can we interview him? Because then we had like two military guys supporting of the same story.
And I mean, and that's all in Watchers 10. There's also some behind-the-scenes stuff in the book Nephilim Hybrid, but it all just overlaps and dovetails together. And what's important about this is it raises more questions than it answers. For instance, this thing had 6 fingers and 6 toes. It had flaming red hair. By all accounts, and even George Norrie states it live on a Skype interview, which is in Watchers 10, that interview with George. And thank you, George, for coming on the record with us. But George Norrie states, L.A., it sounds just like the biblical Nephilim. And I concur and say, yeah, that's why we're so interested in it. 6 fingers, 6 toes, red hair, 12 feet tall. And we know that, like Ishbi-Benob or Goliath, these giants that we hear about in the biblical narrative were 10, 12 feet tall. Heck, I discovered a 9-footer out in Catalina, which we show in Watchers 10. We show how the photograph has been redacted at the museum.
Yeah, that's actually a great story, if you don't mind talking to just about that, because when you see the actual photograph and then the current photograph, which is literally cutting off right below from where the gentlemen are digging, and then shows nothing of the actual discovery. I was blown away at how blatantly they went to redact this. And
we walked into the museum together, and we're looking around, and we're looking at the Glidden display that they had there, and then we look up to the left and way up high, and there's this picture that LA had found in their vaults with the giant cropped off the bottom. And I was like, I said, LA, I can't believe they did this. Why? And actually, the idea that picture had been doctored like that really made me feel creepy. Like, there is definitely, in the work that we've done together, there seems to be a global cover-up of really anything truthful about anything concerning the giants. I mean, it just we hear such nonsense about it. And then when you actually do your research and discover something, it's immediately buried. It's immediately obfuscated, so people can't see it.
It's interesting because this is John in London. I was doing some research on giants, and I noticed that quite recently they found giants and big Buddha statues right down in the Grand Canyon of all places. And my understanding is that somewhere in North America there was a big cave, and they've got all these giants together, these redhead giants, as they described them then, and they burnt them inside a cave. And it seems to have been a witch hunt, not just in America, but all over the world, of these Nephilims, of these giants. I know LA talks about it in the Bible as Nephilim. But what's clear to me is that even, my understanding as well, was that Wesley Clark, the general, his son, made a video regarding what was called Vimanas, and one that was being found out in a cave in Afghanistan. I wondered if your guy that was talking to you there about the giant case, whether they mentioned the Vimanas as well, LA.
Well, what you're kind of mixing a bunch of stuff together. Where you're talking about the cave in the America where the giants, the red-haired giants, went in. I actually cover that. We don't cover it in the film, but it's in the book. The two are together, and by the way, there's the special offer on your site.
That's right.
You get them both with a bunch of bonuses. You get Watchers 10 Nephilim hybrids, all for basically $39.99. But you also get a free CD called Communion, some great music, a 1-year PPS subscription, and Richard and I both write for that, as well as other really cool offers. There's some great articles. It comes in as a PDF file in your inbox, so you know, and it's just, I mean, that's free.
For everybody out there to know, PPS is politics, prophecy, supernatural.
Right, and then you get our Watchers 3 for free. But here's the deal: in the Nephilim Hybrids book, and by the way, you can go to your site. It's right up there. But Dr. J special, $39.99, and you can avail yourself of this, what we think is groundbreaking information. And we haven't even touched on the DNA evidence, for crying out loud. But here's the deal: the Paiutes, which are a Native American indigenous tribe, have a legend of tall, very tall, red-haired, six-fingered cannibalistic giants that roam the earth, that would steal their women, that would eat them and eat their children and all this. And so they finally warred against them. I've been to the cave. It's called the Lovelock Cave. I've been to the cave. The cave is sealed off. It's just the entrance there. And the entrance on the roof of the cave is all blackened from a fire. But I sat down with a Paiute elderess and asked her specifically, what's the legend? And she just told it to me verbatim. You know, this is their oral tradition. And they got them in the cave, and any giants that came out, they shot them. Well, we know that that's a dry lake bed. And in the early part of the 20th century, a 12-footer was found in that lake bed. And, of course, the skeleton's vanished. What we show in the book, and look, when you've been to the cave, it's dark. It's not like a tourist attraction. It's in the middle of nowhere, typical BLM. They got a little deck there. When you go in the cave, there's absolutely nothing to see. Here's the cave. Okay, thank you. It's all sealed up. It used to go way back into the mountain. It doesn't do that because they sealed up the cave, all right? Why did they do that? So on one part of the cave, in order to get there, you'd have to get off the deck, walk around, and you'd really have to be like, there's no light. So you'd have to bring a flashlight. Someone found a 5-fingered handprint, a huge blackened 5-fingered handprint.
So one finger less than these other giants.
Well, but it's huge. But it's huge. It's like 12 inches. The thing is huge, and it was there. And unfortunately, They took a picture of it. They went on social media. By the time I got there, which was about 30 days later,
Gone.
Someone redacted it.
Yeah. Well, I believe it.
Now,
seems to always happen that way. Go ahead, Johnny.
What's also interesting, sorry to overjudge you there, Dr. J, overtalk you. Well, LA, you're a religious and a spiritual man. You speak to a lot of spiritual people. And one thing that I'm not sort of condoning it, but I think there's a passage in the Quran where they talk about this white, pink, redhead monster, a sort of hybrid, a half human, half beast, i.e. Nephilim, that's locked up, and it's telling this story, and it's literally the Dajjal, or what the Asians call the Antichrist. It's a very similar storyline, and I'm wondering, because this gentleman that's taken this C-130 plane and back carried this giant, this redhead giant that they've caught there in Kandahar. What are they doing with it in regard to, are they taking samples of it? Are they making hybrids out of it? It's very concerning.
Or cloning it. That's just as bad.
Exactly. It's heaven and hell on earth at the same time.
Well, here's something to think about. We have no idea how old that thing is. Is it 50 years old? Is it 500 years old? Is it 1,000 years old? I mean, we don't know. We don't know the lifespan of these things. Nobody does.
But we do know in the Bible that certain humans lived to 800, if not older.
There you go.
Now,
the other aspect is, how long ago were some of these giants actually walking around on the Earth? And in Watchers 10, we have carbon-14 data of the actual age of when these beings died. And that to me was as shocking as our DNA results, L.A. I mean, that one, the La Arroya skull was much younger than anything I would have ever imagined.
Is that the one with the hair you're talking about, the baby?
No, that's a greatly elongated skull, incredibly elongated, with no forehead. From the brow ridge right above the eyes, it basically goes back at a 45-degree angle.
His whole face is at a slant.
Yeah, you just can't do that.
There's a very famous photograph. Obviously we always hear about Robert Wadlow, the tallest Westerner in these nice suits and stuff. But there's a very famous picture of what looks like a Japanese sumo wrestler. And he's standing up in the village and he's about to walk down a high road.
Right,
and it's a very distinctive picture. Now, are we talking their giants, or are we just talking deformities of someone who ate too many greens?
That's CGI. That's all CGI. I remember that, Rick. I sent that to you. The guy's like in a sumo wrestler thing, and he's probably a 12 to 15 footer.
Yeah.
It's CGI.
Yeah.
Computer generated image.
No. Let me ask you this. You mentioned Richard. The carbon-14 dating, which you found just as astonishing as the DNA evidence. I want to hear about the DNA results, because that, is smoking gun for many, many people. So I'd love to hear what you guys have to say about that, and what you had to say, Richard, about the dating.
Sure. Well, L.A. was introduced to a guy that all of a sudden we have a lot of echo on the line. It wasn't.
Coming from LA. Can you wear headphones by any chance, LA? Because I think what's happening is.
Oh, there. It went away suddenly.
Okay.
LA had a person that wanted to help with the finances of actually doing the DNA testing, and it's not cheap. It's very expensive. This is why, some of the results that we've gotten have been very expensive and taken several years to accomplish. I mean, the original process of this started when we went to Peru and wanted to find out more about who these beings were, where their origins were, how old were they when they died, and how many years ago was it that they've been here. And we had heard numbers were being thrown about that to me didn't make sense. Oh, this has to be 3,000 years old. And there were like huge numbers being spouted, but there was no evidence. There was nothing to give us any actual scientific evidence of what really was going on there. So over the past 3 years, we've involved archaeologists, we've involved geneticists, we had 3 DNA labs working on this process, and we finally were able to, I bumped into this guy at a conference in Arizona, and I'm backstage getting ready to show Watchers 8. This is about that time when we were doing that film. And I said, and I had in my hand a replica of the baby mummy skull that we were showing in Watchers 8, which we had at the screening the other night that everybody saw. And I was showing it, holding out to this guy, and he goes, "Oh, I have a skull." I mean, that's something no one ever says to me. I was just kind of shocked. I said, "You do?" And he has one of those big phones with the big screen on it, you know, and he whips out this picture, and it's this enormous head. And I'm going, "You have that?" I said, "How the heck did you get it out of Peru? Because, you know, you can't do that anymore." And he said, "Oh, this was been in our family since the 1930s. When no one cared if you took a skull out of Peru." And I said, "Really?" And I said, "You know how hard it's been for LA and I trying to just get genetic samples of bone tissue out of Peru. I mean, it's red tape a go-go. You can't do anything without, you know, for any scientific purpose." And I don't know, we've been told that it could be that they didn't want the elongated head people to be associated with some kind of alien uprising or something like that, you know. So, you know, we just had one thing after another. Now, they don't seem to mind taking hair samples out of the country. You can get some hair from a mummy, and they don't seem to care about that, which we have done. But actual bone samples is much more difficult. So I said, "Well, would you mind if we took some DNA samples from this skull?" I said, "This is something we've been trying to do and have been prevented from." And he said, "Yeah, no problem." So the guy lives in a little remote place in Oregon. LA and I fly up there, and we meet Mondo Gonzalez, who's a archaeologist with a master's degree. And we all converge at this little building, and he brings out his grandfather's collection of skeletal remains. One of them was an actual human, which was really cool, because then we had an actual human skull we could compare with on camera with this skull from Peru. And we found out that this skeleton, this head that was massive, was from a city called La Arroyo. And when you look that up, there's a Time magazine website that says La Arroyo is one of the most polluted areas in the world, and it's because there's been mining going on there since the 20s, and there's lead and all other kinds of pollutants in the ground. But this skull was unearthed probably within the first stages of that mining town being done, before they had all the equipment that polluted the place. And apparently the skull was in a museum somewhere because it has museum markings on its forehead. This is typically what they do in Peru, like that big giant skull, which you've probably seen, Dr. J, at the Ica Museum.
Yes.
It's probably the biggest skull in existence that I know of. We call it the Congo skull. It has the markings on the forehead, the same kind of deal.
Elliot's book, the newest one, Nephilim Hybrids, has fantastic photographs of many skulls. What we're going to talk when we get back from break in a few minutes, the fairies, which I'm already spitting that out there, but you guys will be blown away to see a lot of these very, very vivid photographs. I almost, my personal contention, after going through this book and watching Watchers 10, I think I'd have to say for everybody out there, they go hand in hand. Please, I urge everybody out there to get them both. And if you want to get them both the best way, get that set that LA's offered and Richard's offered, which you can get from that link. And you will see that link. It'll stay there for eternity or until their special ends. And, of course, on all the other networks as this goes, you guys will always have a chance to hear it. But I highly recommend, rather than, you know, cherry-picking a piece, you guys have a chance to get something fantastic with a lot of extra bonuses at a greatly discounted price. So I just wanted to throw that in there because I think it's very important. Nephilim Hybrids is a truly fantastic book, and I'm looking at some of the skulls right now, and I don't know. I'm speechless with regards to that. Now, we are coming extremely close to break. Would you rather talk about DNA after or before? What can you get in the next couple minutes, gentlemen?
Well,
Go ahead, L.A.
Yeah, I mean, we've got like 5 minutes to talk about the DNA. So we're going to do another hour. Is that?
Oh yeah. If you guys want to take the break now, and then we'll do it right when we come back. That's up to you.
That sounds like a plan. Let's do that.
Okay, everybody, stay tuned. Literally, just 2.5 short minutes. We'll be right back live with L.A. Marzulli and Richard Shaw on Watchers 10, and so much more. For those of you who have been interactive, please feel free to continue to interact while we get this incredible story, and stories, plural, out there to you. This is Dr. J. We'll be right back.
I'm professional baseball player Trevor Bell, and you're listening to Dr. J Radio Live.
That is absolutely right. Welcome back to the second hour of Dr. J Radio Live. That happened to be a good friend, former Major League Baseball player Trevor Bell, who happens to be a big fan of the show and the topics. So now let's get started with the second hour, where again I am broadcasting from the City of Angels, or not so angelic, depending on who you speak to, just as my guests, L.A. Marzulli and Richard Shaw, also happen to be right here in the West Coast, Pacific Time. On the East Coast happens to be my webmaster, Tom, and everybody in between. We are broadcasting for you, coast to coast, in the PM, not AM. That's right, that's a different show. But this is not just coast to coast PM, because this is Dr. J Radio Live International, where my co-host Johnny Webb is awake. Poor guy. 4 a.m. Greenwich Mean Time, taking your calls and questions and monitoring different chat rooms. Now remember, the name of the show is the same name as everything. All you have to remember is Dr. J Radio Live. Think Larry King Live. That's basically it. Just throw in the name or the word radio. So Dr. J Radio Live. You want to reach us on Instagram, Twitter, Flickr, Tumblr, Facebook, Google+, Gmail, and especially YouTube, where we archive our shows. Slack, Pinterest, and even our domain. Even Gmail account, which is not used because we have custom email. So don't forget, you will get a chance to see incredible footage on top of hearing this interview again and again for free once it makes it to its archives after it goes around the world several times with our affiliated networks plus terrestrial stations. Now, let's go back to our guests before we pick up on what I wanted to talk about, which is, of course, the DNA. I want to give you both, gentlemen, a chance to plug in your info, where people can get your books, what's coming up next. But before I do, let me just say this. Every guest who has ever appeared on our show, we have a new tab, Books and Videos. You can click on that and it'll take you directly to their website or Amazon page to buy them. But in this particular case, look for that special logo, special tab, which is literally just to the left side of the main homepage. And I'm going to let LA talk about that as well as everything else, websites and upcoming stuff before I turn it over to Richard. Go ahead, LA.
Great. You know, we are doing a special with our affiliates, and, you know, we call it the Dr. J special. So when you click on that, you get Watchers 10 DNA, Nephilim hybrids, all for basically $39.99. But then you get 3 bonuses: a community CD, a 1-year subscription to Politics, Prophecy, and the Supernatural, which is our e-magazine. That's a $24 bonus. The CD is a $10 bonus. Then you get Watchers 3, Fingerprints of the Supernatural, another $20. So really, if you were to buy all that stuff separate, it'd be $93. And what's great about buying from Dr. J, that's why, you know, you click on that special, those bonuses are only available to those people that click on that banner on Dr. J's webpage. That's it. We're not offering those bonuses. And then, of course, Dr. J gets a cut of the profit. So you're helping him out, you're helping us out, and you're educating yourself. This is real cutting-edge stuff, folks. We're not making it up. It's real cutting-edge stuff. It took almost a year to, you know, get all this information. Some of it has been taking 3 years, specifically the DNA. And Richard and I, it's just the two of us. There is no crew. There's not, you know, like 30 people working for us. There's no great big budget. It's just the two of us. And because of Richard's brilliance when it comes to editing and camera shooting, we do these things on a shoestring. It's guerrilla filmmaking at its best. But the quality of the film, the production value is way up there. And it looks, in my opinion, as good as pretty much anything you see on the tube.
Agreed. Absolutely agreed. And let's talk about, before I give it over to Richard, what's coming up for the future. I know there's going to be a Watchers 11 and probably 12, and you host